So I think we've got a pretty good number of people here at this point, and so we will start. I just wanted to introduce Walt Woodward, who is our state historian. Probably most of you know we have a state historian, but if you don't, he is the state historian. He's also an associate professor of history at UConn. He's the narrator and producer of Today in Connecticut. That's with Connecticut Humanities, and Greeting the Nutmeg, podcast of Connecticut history with Connecticut Explored magazine. And he also writes from the State Historian column in Connecticut Explored. And if you've not ever read Connecticut Explored, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful publication, and lets you know about all kinds of things and places. Well, we can't go to many of those places right now, but all kinds of places in Connecticut that you may not be aware exist. So it's actually quite fascinating. And I think Walt will give us another glimpse into fascinating Connecticut. That's not quite the title of his book, but
maybe the next one.
Maybe the next one. And I know Walt, he won't really plug his book too much, but I do encourage you to, and he'll do a plug at the end, but while I'm thinking of it, the book is wonderful, and get it in the library or get a copy of it somewhere. But anyway, you'll get some insights into it now. And I know how most authors are. They don't shamelessly plug themselves, and a little plugging is not bad.
Well, I've said from the beginning, I'm not like most authors, but I won't bore you with shameless shilling. I'll just save it for the end. Those of you who survived the talk can, sit through that little bit. Anyway, thank you so much for giving up a part of, one of these last late fall afternoons to come hear about this book. Creating Connecticut is a book I am both quite proud of and that I worked very hard to create. And when I got done with the book, I was thinking about how am I going to tell people about why I wrote this book? And I thought back to the very first graduate seminar I had years ago when I was a graduate student, and my first graduate seminar. I'm so excited. I'm going to be a professional historian now, and I'm drinking history out of a fire hose, books in every class, and every week a book for, I'm just reading history at a furious pace. And I went into my first seminar with my new grad students, all geared up to impress people. And this dour, who is now a distinguished university professor emeritus, Richard D. Brown, asked the first question that I was ever asked as a graduate student. Why did the author write this book? And I was completely nonplussed because I had never thought about the subject in exactly that way. But we would spend 3 hours every week for the next 15 weeks talking about that question and picking apart what we thought the author's reasons were for having created their study. And I came to realize it's a fundamentally important question. What makes a person think that the topic they are going to write about is worth several years of their time to get down on paper? And why do they think it is worth, several days or a week of your time to actually sit down and read it? Well, when I finished this book, said, I need to tell people that right up front, what this book is about, because this is in many ways a book that was written with a mission. So with your permission, I'm going to share screen. And then what I'm going to do is, well, it's better not to tell people what you're going to do. It's probably better just to go ahead and do it. So you all should be seeing a book on a blue background. Is that what we have?
Excellent. I'm seeing that, yes.
Okay. So let me begin by telling you why I wrote this book. As Connecticut State Historian, I've had the good fortune to spend my career focusing my historical research on this state, its people, and their stories. Creating Connecticut is a part of that effort. It's a collection of 24 stories, 12 shorter, 12 longer, each of which tells us something important about Connecticut's past, something that still, in one way or another, affects our lives as Connecticutans today. All of them are designed to be readable, engaging, and informative introductions to aspects of our state's history that will be new or nearly so to most readers. Some of the stories in Creating Connecticut show people we thought we knew, Mark Twain, Nathan Hale, in new and surprising ways. Some tell us about people many of us don't know, Eleazar Wheelock, Samson Occam, Adrian Block, but perhaps we ought to. Many are about events, movements, and periods of change, the Pequot War, the Hartford Witch Hunt, outmigration to Connecticut's Western Reserve, Irish immigration into the state, crucial moments when Connecticutans were tested and called on by circumstance to change their minds, values, approaches, and even lives, times like right now. And some are about the uniqueness of our state and the ways in which Connecticutans have celebrated their past in the past. The focus here is on stories that both interest and matter. You can read them from front to back. They're arranged more or less in chronological order, or you can scan the table of contents and jump in with the story that seems most interesting to you. My hope is that you'll read them all and come away with the desire to know more about Connecticut history. So now you know why I've written this book. And what I'd like to do with the rest of the talk is read passages from a few of the stories in Creating Connecticut, answer any questions you may have, and then tell you how you can get your own signed copy of this rare literary gem. That's what my wife says it is, so you're getting it from an authority. And I'll begin with a reading from Creating Connecticut's first story about Connecticut's restless beginnings and the 50 years of conflict between the Dutch and English and indigenous people of this state, a restless era that is today an all but forgotten part of our history. It begins on a day in April in the year 1614. In the spring of 1614, Adrian Block sailed the little ship he had built and named Onrust, Restlessness, into the river the Algonquians called Connecticut, or the place of the long water. The 47-year-old Dutchman was as restless as his vessel and anxious to make up the losses he had experienced the previous winter when his ship Tiger had accidentally burned to the waterline at Manhattan. The trader and explorer was anxious too to secure the Dutch government's recent promise of a trading monopoly over any new countries or harbors discovered by Dutch explorers. Restless to turn his fortunes round, Block came up a river that was itself restless, running fresh and full of upriver snowmelt and spring rain. He named the river the Versha, meaning fresh, as in fast running. And as the first known European to probe its courses and seek its opportunities, he launched an era of restlessness that would change this river and its people forever. Then as now, restless had many meanings, and all would apply to the world the arrival of this little boat would create. A generation of restless Europeans, both Dutch and English, constantly in motion, never ceasing or pausing, would come to the Connecticut, the place of the long water, first in search of trade with the indigenous people, and soon after in quest of those people's lands and resources. Some of them were spiritually restless, troubled in mind and soul, and seeking a place to serve their God as their consciences demanded. For the Native Americans already here, the arrival of the Onrust heralded a new restlessness, first as a jostle to control distribution of European trade goods, and later as they fought the incoming insurgents' efforts to take their lands and control their lives. For Connecticut's first peoples, the arrival of the Onrust brought centuries of restlessness, literal unrest, sleepless worry, sickness, turmoil, and death. Time is the acid rain of historical memory. Slowly, often over generations stretching into centuries. Important details of the past can fade one by one until what was once crucial to the life of a time and a people is all but forgotten. So it has been with the Dutch history of Connecticut. Most school children are still taught that the first European to come to Connecticut was Adrian Block. And many students of Hartford history know the Dutch had a trading house there, somewhere close to the later site of Samuel Colt's onion-domed arms manufacturing complex. But for the average Connecticut, that's the sum of it. The English arrived and the Dutch faded to black. The rest of the colonial story, as they remember it, is a simplistic tale of English versus Indians that quickly morphs into one about patriots versus Tories. But that's not how it was. For its first 50 years, Connecticut was a restless, seething site of constant competition, pitting nation against nation, tribe against tribe, and colonies against colonies in a Rubik's Cube of combinations that always involved the Dutch. Nothing was done by the English at Connecticut without first calculating the Dutch response in New Netherland or at the States General, the seat of government in The Hague. No English settlement was expanded, no tribal alliance contracted, no trading venture launched without calculating the Dutch reaction. The Dutch Connecticut story was a deeply conflicted, sometimes harrowing experience. Those who lived in that time knew their lives depended on knowing it in great detail. Now, I go on in that chapter to highlight the nearly continuous state of conflict between the various English plantations, the Dutch authorities, and Indian communities, and the shifting alliances that made life a restless and fearful struggle for everyone in Connecticut's first half century. It was a restless era that set the stage for much that came after, including Connecticut's unique history of witch hunting. In another chapter, I try to answer many of the questions that history raises. Connecticut's record in handling witchcraft cases raises many questions. Some are unique to Connecticut, some apply to all witch hunts. Why, for example, in the early years of witch hunting, 1647 to 1663, was Connecticut's New England's fiercest prosecutor of witches? Why did it switch from being the region's greatest witch killer to the colony that ended executions permanently a generation before Salem? Why did people even believe in witchcraft? What exactly did people think witches could do? And why did it scare them so much? Why were most witches women? What made someone who had been a neighbor for so many years suddenly so dangerous that community safety made executing them mandatory? Well, the answer to those questions began not in Connecticut, but in Europe. And in the chapter, I trace the Renaissance history of witch hunting, explain the magical view of the world that made such witch hunts possible, and then I discuss the English witch hunts that were peaking when the Puritans emigrated to Connecticut. The Puritans who came to New England in the early decades of the 1600s carried their fear of the devil and his minions to New England, along with their Bibles, clothing, and seed stock. England's greatest witch hunt took place between 1644 and 1647 in the Puritan counties of East Anglia. There, a man named Matthew Hopkins, who styled himself England's witch finder general, led a witch hunt that resulted in many executions. Some sources claim as many as 300. The East Anglian location of Hopkins' witch hunt is significant. It's the place from which many of Connecticut's early settlers had emigrated. They knew much about, and some had direct connections to, the Hopkins trials. Many must have feared that if the devil was assaulting the English Puritans this furiously in East Anglia, it was only a matter of time until he would find his way to New England. It's not surprising, therefore, that New England's first execution for witchcraft took place in 1647, just as the English witch hunt was winding down. Perhaps the most interesting thing this first New England witch death is that we wouldn't know anything about it except for two sentences that appeared in two different documents produced 100 miles away from each other and found some 250 years apart. Sometime between March and May of 1647, Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop, whose History Journal of New England is one of the most important historical sources from the period, wrote in that journal the following sentence: "One blank of Windsor, arraigned and executed at Hartford for a witch." Now, Winthrop left the blank space intending, no doubt, to add the witch's name once he had received further information. But for the next 257 years, that's all that was known. Some person who lived in Windsor was tried for witchcraft in Hartford and then executed. What was she charged with? Who conducted the trial? Who testified against her? What was her defense? Where was she hanged? None of this was known. In truth, historians didn't even know whether New England's first convicted witch was a man or a woman. Then, in 1904, Annie Elliott Trumbull, daughter of Connecticut's first state librarian, announced that she had come into possession of a little old volume with a worn sheepskin binding that contained the manuscript diary of Matthew Grant, a resident of Windsor from 1635 to 1681. In it, she reported she had found a Grant-penned entry stating on May 26, 1647, Alice Young was hanged. Finally, after 2.5 centuries, it was confirmed that New England's first executed witch was, as supposed, a woman, and that her name was Alice Young. That remains most of what is known for certain about her, though historian Richard Ross has recently argued that Alice emigrated to Windsor from London in 1640, which may have put her culturally at odds with her Windsor neighbors, most of whom had emigrated from the English West Country. These cultural differences made her an outsider, he speculates, which combined with an epidemic of deadly influenza that hit Windsor the year of Young's execution may have factored in her being singled out for prosecution. Now, the chapter goes on to detail Connecticut's record as early New England's fiercest prosecutor of witchcraft, and how one man, Governor John Winthrop Jr., himself an alchemist and magic practitioner, intervened to bring witch executions in Connecticut to an end. It's a powerful story, I think, with a message as important as any from the better known Salem trials, and I think you would enjoy it. For the past decade, many Connecticutans, and especially our younger generation, have left our state to seek their fortunes elsewhere. This is truly troublesome, but it's not the first time it's happened. And in another chapter, I tell the story of the great outflux of young Connecticutans in the early 1800s, as the dream or necessity of finding a better life took them to a part of Ohio known as the Connecticut Western Reserve. Here are a few passages that talk about their journeys west and their feelings about leaving. Connecticut in the early 19th century, as in the 21st century, was hemorrhaging its young people, the lifeblood of its future, to other, more economically attractive locations. And it had been doing so for a long time. Although they dispersed to sites both far and near, one area in particular proved the most powerful magnet for Connecticut expatriates. This was the part of Northeast Ohio, stretching 120 miles west from the Pennsylvania border, a place many people called New Connecticut, but which was also known and is still today called Connecticut's Western Reserve. This was a part of its original charter territory that Connecticut reserved ownership of when it ceded the remainder of its charter lands to the newly formed United States in 1786. The journey west was both long and hard, between 500 and 650 50 miles, depending on the route selected and the destination. Road conditions ranged from very bad to deplorable for most of the journey. In heavy rains, roads became mud pits and streams impassable. In some low-lying or wetland areas, efforts were made to ameliorate the muddy conditions by building corduroy roads of logs placed perpendicular to the direction of travel, which provided their own unique kind of jarring discomfort. It was an experience no traveler would ever forget. In addition to the considerable physical dangers of traveling bad roads, fording swelled streams and rivers, and climbing and descending high mountain passes, migrants commonly experience inhospitable treatment at overcrowded and often squalid inns and taverns. They slept fitfully among strangers, ate bad food with rowdy, drunken, and sometimes dangerous fellow migrants, and fought off both homesickness and fear of the unknown. How did all these migrants feel about pulling up roots and leaving their native state? Some undoubtedly felt a pioneer's excitement at facing a world that was all possibility. Others, perhaps the younger sons not in line to inherit the family farm, seethed with resentment about being forced into exile. Some, it is clear, saw having to leave Connecticut for the West as a sign of shame, a visible symbol that they were the expendable ones. How else can we explain Margaret Van Horn Dwight's comment on day 2 of her journey? The country we pass through till we are beyond New York, I need not describe to you, nor indeed could I, for I am attended by a very unpleasant, though not uncommon companion, one to whom I have bowed in subjection ever since I left you, pride. It has entirely prevented me seeing the country lest I should be known, and so I suppose it will attend me to the mountains, and then I'm sure it will bid me adieu. Hiding in the wagon so she wouldn't be recognized. This is an aspect of outmigration that we rarely encounter and hardly ever think about. Once we do, though, it certainly complicates those long-standing views we have of Anglos hot in pursuit of manifest destiny. Surely, Connecticutans left their state with mixed feelings. But even as young Connecticutans were moving out of state, others were moving in. Connecticut had found its future in harnessing its abundant water power to drive the factories of the Industrial Revolution, and that created an unprecedented need for workers to build a new kind of infrastructure. The Irish in Connecticut chapter covers nearly 350 years of the Irish story here, but I'd like to present this afternoon 3 snapshots. The first is of what it was like for the Irish who arrived in Connecticut in the years before the potato famine of the mid-1840s. And then I want to flash forward 50 years to look at what life was like for the children and grandchildren of those migrants a half century later. And I'd like to close out with just a glimpse of what it feels like to be an Irish Connecticut today. So, enter the Irish. To meet the need for laborers, contractors for the Farmington Canal brought in 28 gangs of Irish canal workers called navvies from Galway and Cork. Hartford brought in 400 Irishmen for the Enfield Canal project. Life for the navvies was hellish. Like the Irish railroad track workers who soon followed them, they dug furiously sun up to sunset, goaded by overseer contractors whose profits depended on how much labor they could extract every day. Eyewitnesses marveled at the physical prowess of the Irishmen as they ran full wheelbarrows up narrow planks from ditches 20 feet deep. They lived in temporary shanty camps where overcrowding, poor sanitation, and stagnant water made disease a constant. Alcohol was woven into a workday marked by short bursts of furious digging, followed by a trip to the whiskey barrel and a dram from the jigger boss. Irish workers were paid only for the days weather and their health let them work. and they earned just 75 cents a day, 1/3 less than native-born laborers. The navvies represented Connecticut's first major influx of practicing Irish Catholics, and the descendants of Connecticut's Puritan founders didn't like that, not one bit. Connecticut had no resident priests, and the Yankees made it clear that that's the way they wanted it. When Reverend John Powers of New York requested permission to celebrate Mass for canal workers at New Haven's Protestant Seamen's Chapel on Long Wharf, he was told, "We have no popery in New Haven, and we don't want any." Despite that overt intolerance, popery did come to Connecticut, at first through the services of an itinerant priest from Rhode Island, who in 1828 conducted house masses on the east bank of the river in Hartford. The following year, Hartford became home to Most Holy Trinity, Connecticut's first Catholic church. The newspaper Connecticut Observer was simply aghast. How will it read in history that in 1829, Hartford in the state of Connecticut was made the center of a Roman Catholic mission? Well, let's jump forward 50 years and see how the children and grandchildren of these unwanted newcomers are faring. Unlike their fathers, by 1900, 2/3 of second-generation Irish men worked in skilled trades or higher, with economic security mirroring that of the Connecticut Yankees. Irish American men dominated police and fire departments and monopolized the building trades. And while 90% of their mothers remained domestic servants, second-generation Irish American daughters rose to become clerks, skilled factory workers, teachers, and union organizers too. Better jobs came in part because of high Irish involvement in Connecticut's labor movement. Irish Americans made up most of many unions' membership and its leadership. So, what's it like to be Irish in Connecticut today? Well, if you're Irish, you know, and if you're not, here it is. To be Irish in Connecticut today is for those lucky enough to claim Irish American ancestry, a source of both identity and pride, underscored by an extraordinary long-term record of Irish Connecticutans' achievements in politics, law, public safety, commerce, industry, and culture. The fact that such achievements were made by a people once reviled as incapable, discriminated against as inferior, and treated as unwelcome interlopers in a society that took offense at their very presence is an important reminder, especially in times like these, that the very people we fear at one moment can sometimes turn out to be the source of some of our society's greatest strengths. Now, Connecticut's most important cultural icon, and Connecticut is lucky that it has so many, is the Gilded Age author and satirist Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain. His historic home in Hartford is also one of the country's great historic landmarks. In Mark Twain and the Historic House Problem, I come right out and ask a question I think everyone thinks about when they go and visit that wonderful house of that great man. But I'm the one who dared to come right out and ask the question, why can't I smell smoke? Twain was no ordinary smoker. He was a deeply committed, unregenerate, professional pipe and cigar smoker who mastered his craft at an early age and continued to improve upon it for the next 68 years. In the great age of industrial production, Twain turned himself into a literary factory, belching cigar smoke as the words poured forth. Wherever Twain went, tobacco smoke followed, and one of his greatest fears was to be where tobacco wasn't. In 1867, one day before sailing to Honolulu from British Columbia, Twain found a local wholesale tobacconist and brought 3,000 cheroots and 15 pounds of tobacco. That was about 1 cigar per nautical mile of the impending voyage. Later that afternoon, he went back and bought another 3,000 more cheroots. And that night, shortly after beginning a farewell public lecture, Twain stopped his talk in midstream, called his manager up to the stage, and said, "Pond, I fear that cigar place may close before I get through here. Go there now and get 1,500 more of those cheroots." A cheroot, by the way, is a little cigar. In the morning, Twain and his 7,500 cheroots, plus his tobacco, happily embarked for the Sandwich Isles. Now, Twain knew smoking was generally unhealthy, but he saw the habit as a kind of life vest that provided a wellness safety margin. He told the story of the doctor who visited an 80-year-old woman who was in rapidly failing health. "You must stop drinking," he told her. "I never touched a drop of alcohol in my life," she answered. "Then you must immediately give up smoking," the doctor said. "I have never, ever smoked," she said indignantly. "Well, then," the doctor replied, "there's no way I can help you. You are a sinking ship with no freight to throw overboard." I suspect most people would agree that elections in recent years, including the one we're still in, have left people on both sides of the political aisle with something of a bad taste in their mouths. That's why it might be time to revive one of our state's oldest and for centuries most time-honored traditions, the Connecticut election cake. What's an election cake and why is it a Connecticut tradition? An election cake was a big, rich fruit, spice, and sugar yeast cake baked up in huge quantities and served to all comers during the festivities surrounding first our colonies and later our state's annual elections. The story of how election cake became a Connecticut tradition goes all the way back to the days of the Puritans. Now, one of the things that made the Puritans so pure was that they didn't believe in the annual round of Catholic and Anglican holidays. They didn't celebrate Christmas or Easter or any of the numerous saints and festival days. And for them, New Year's Day came on March 26th. So no midnight kisses or dropping ball either. While they rejected all of these supposedly invented occasions for mirth, they did believe that in the year 1662, Connecticut, for reasons still not exactly clear, got something that was very much worth celebrating, a royal charter from King Charles II that gave the Connecticut colony virtual independence more than a century before the American Revolution. Unlike Massachusetts and Virginia and the other royally governed American colonies, Connecticut could make its own laws and, more important, elect its own leaders without royal oversight. This right to choose their own leaders was seen from the start as fundamentally important and distinctive, worth celebrating and worth protecting. So it's not surprising that on those days when Connecticutans gathered to choose their leaders, back then election day took place in early May, these otherwise celebration-starved Puritans found reason to celebrate. And what better way to do so than with cake and lots of it? We know Connecticutans were feasting on election day cakes well before the American Revolution because the colonial records tell us so. And if incorporating election cake into the ceremonies was an important Connecticut tradition before the American Revolution, it became even more important after. As Connecticutans themselves spread across the country to the new lands in the American West, the election cake tradition went with them. Election cake recipes appear in early cookbooks in states across the nation, and they are abundantly found in the manuscript cookbooks left by individuals in our historical societies and archives. Reading these works, a few things becomes crystal clear. Election cakes were central to the election rituals in many places, but especially here in Connecticut. And making an extraordinary election cake, perhaps with one's own special ingredient or unique mixing process, became a point of honor with many homekeepers. Having a reputation for making delicious election cakes became a competitive source of status. During the 1800s, as Connecticut industrialized, welcomed people from many new nations, broke its official ties to the old Puritan church, and experienced the sectional divide that led to the Civil War, some of Connecticut's time-honored election day traditions, riding out to meet the new governor as he made his way into the Capitol, and parading behind the state's ministers to hear an election sermon in the First Congregational Church. These fell by the wayside, but the election cake remained a steady and delicious habit. When the General Assembly decided in 1876 to change the start of its sessions from May to early January, beginning in 1877, a journalist lamenting the switch of Election Day to midwinter said, "The coming election parade of May 1876 is likely to be the last that will take place in Connecticut. Though the sermon has gone out, though the parade is going out, though the whole institution may become an element of the past, one feature of it will always remain, and that is the election cake. Lovers of it, when it's just right, say no other cake equals it. And it's only necessary to add is that nobody can make it but a Connecticut housekeeper, and that each housekeeper and her circle of adherents know that she can make it a deal better than any of her rivals." Well, perhaps in this deeply contested time of unending elections, this is exactly the right time for the Connecticut election cake to make its comeback. At this moment when American politics seems so divisive and bitter, wouldn't it be great if a cohort of culinary Connecticutans, men and women equally this time, joined together to use their ovens to remind people that democracy, the right to choose the people who rule your government, is a sweet privilege indeed. And but what better way could there be to celebrate sweet democracy than to bring back the tradition of the Connecticut election cake? In fact, we could set up kind of a Marshall Plan to send election cakes down to the state of Georgia between now and January. I have put, by the way, in the back of the book, I guess we just have to wait for this to play out. I have put in the book, in this chapter, at the end of the chapter, a recipe for a modern election cake. But if you would like to have one, the last thing I would do is make you buy the book to get the recipe. So I'm going to give you my email address at the end of the talk, which is just about to happen. And it's the easiest email address at the University of Connecticut to remember. So if you will email me and would like a copy of this election cake recipe, I would be very happy to send it to you. I had literally, I'd say dozens and dozens of people from around the state get the recipe and make election cakes last week for the election. It was really a wonderful thing to see. They sent me pictures and stories, and sitting down with a neighbor who is of a completely different viewpoint and sharing a piece of cake and celebrating why it really is good to be part of a democracy. That's a pretty good thing. And so that is an overview of some of the stories in creating Connecticut. And I must say it's only a sampler. In addition, there are stories on the rough justice meted out to Nathan Hale by the British. There is a recounting of Connecticut's 1935 pull out all the stops 300th anniversary of the state's founding. The inspiring 275-year-old story of the Lyman family's whatever it takes devotion to make and keep Lyman orchards a thriving Connecticut farm. There's a story about the Puritans' only art form, gravestone carving, a profile of Irish-born Governor John Dempsey, the only immigrant governor of Connecticut since the colonial era, and a meditation on just what it is that makes Connecticut such a unique state. And I close with a story that's very personal, and it's how at a very late stage in my own life, I was able to realize a childhood dream of coming to own a house that was built in 1764 by my sixth great grandfather, Israel Woodward, and his son, Eliezer. Their initials are, Israel's initials are in the first floorboard that was put on the house, and Eliezer's are in the last floorboard put in the attic. And that's where I am talking to you from. And it's been, it's a great pleasure for me to live in this place, and it is wonderful to share these stories. I hope you like what you've heard enough to want to read more. And if you do, you'll check out a copy of Creating Connecticut, pick up one at your local bookstore or even from an online dealer. And of course, if you, having read it, would really like to get a copy of Creating Connecticut and share it with family and friends, I would be happy to send you or send a signed copy for $30. That includes everything, tax and the shipping and handling, etc. You can send me an email at walt@uconn.edu for either the cake recipe or for a copy of the book, or you can call me at this phone number, and I will be happy to get a book signed, inscribed to the person you would like it inscribed to, and out certainly right away. I got this wonderful email this morning from someone, believe it or not, at the North Pole. And it said, "Dear Walt, read your book. I love this. I want to share it with all my friends. I'm going to give it to the elves." And so it was signed S. Claus. So what could make me happier? And all I can suggest after that is go thou and do likewise. So thank you so much for listening. I'm now ready to answer questions. My only caution before that is I have now told you everything I know about the topics I've talked about. So from here on out, I'm making it up. But thank you so much for listening.
Well, Walt, I'm going to start with the first question, actually. And there's at least one other question in the chat, but I'd encourage other people to enter it into the chat. So is there a drink that should go along with this cake? Not necessarily in historical terms, perhaps?
There are colonial era drinks, but I have never seen anything that connects a specific beverage with the cake itself. However, rum is never too far away from this cake. The interesting story about the election cake, and I've heard two. One is that it is a descendant of English muster cakes, which were cakes that were baked on muster days when the English militia practiced. And those tended to be at the end of them occasions of very heavy drinking. And the idea was that this heavy, rich spice cake was very good at absorbing alcohol. So that's why they did it with the muster cakes. And there definitely is rum and brandy in the recipe. So it's part of the cake, but most of the alcoholic content bakes off while it's being baked. So it's a flavor. It's not an inducement to drink, but clearly there's a connection between election cake and alcohol, but there's not a specific drink that you pour with it. Good question.
All right, now we'll go to the chat. So Barry asks regarding Salisbury in the northwest corner. Basically, his question is, because of the proximity to the Hudson Valley in New York State, to what extent is the development here related to New York State or the Hudson Valley, or and my question would be, or is it?
Well, very much so, in the sense that, and this certainly applies to the colonial period and especially the 17th century, from the Hudson Valley over to the Connecticut River, that is sort of the epicenter of Dutch English competition for land, and later between New York and Connecticut competition for land. So this area, the area that you're in, was It was the area of the most interaction between cultures and the most contestation between cultures. And, you know, the boundary disputes between New York and Connecticut weren't resolved for, I think, 150 years or so. In fact, the last one was resolved late in the 19th century. So there's a tremendous amount of interaction. Connecticut consistently was sending its troops up to fight in, there were a series of 4 or 5 imperial wars in the late 17th and early 18th century. The route up to fight the French as you were heading for Canada took them right across the western part of the state and then up the Hudson Valley. And there are many diaries and stories of, you know, of people spending time in the region, of having conflicts in the region. And of course, there was always the fear that Indian attacks were going to come down from the north and over from the west. So this was the area that when rumors of war, which were rife in the period, when rumors of war were alive, this was always the area that everyone looked over their shoulders to see what would happen next. So there's actually a very rich history of interaction and competition that's largely unrecorded by anyone since the mid 1700s.
So a related but more southern question, can you talk about how Connecticut got Greenwich early in the 19th century as part of its ceding the nearby Oblong to New York?
You know, I don't know. I don't know all the details of that. So anything I would say would be really superficial. So I don't know how. I honestly don't know how the boundary dispute was ultimately resolved. I know there were commissions after commissions after commissions. If someone is here. You know, I know if my friend Tom Shackman, who lives in Salisbury, if he were there, he would definitely know this story well. And if there's anyone on who can add light and insight, please unmute and share with us. All right, you're going to send me back to my history books for a refresher. Thanks.
Any comment you want to make, Lou, to that effect? Next question, is Connecticutans an official term?
It's not an official term. I guess if there is an official term, the official term is Connecticutter, which does not flow like honey off the tongue. I will tell you where Connecticutans originated. When I became the state historian back in 2004, I stumbled over Connecticutter just a handful of times and said, that is an immensely awkward turn of phrase. I said, I think it's time that we should go for a nickname or not an acronym, but a short name change. And so I decided that Connecticut, we would do what Kansans and Nebraskans and Iowans and Ohioans and other states did. Why aren't we Connecticutans? So I started in my writing to use the word Connecticut, and it was an intentional, like a proselytization to change the nickname. What I didn't realize is that simultaneously and completely independently of what was going on in my head, the publisher of Connecticut Explored magazine, Elizabeth Norman, had come to the same conclusion that Connecticutter should be left on the cutting room floor, and that Connecticut would do really well if it would change its nickname to Connecticutans, or its possessive name. And so she started doing the same thing. We have each been doing it in our writing, and she in her magazine now for 10 or 15 years. And I'm happy to say that it is, you know, it has gotten some purchase and it's taking off. And I've seen it in print and in people's stories, you know, more so in the last year than any other time. first time you hear it, it's like anything, like a new logo for a company. It's sort of like, that's a little awkward. I don't know if I like that any better. But if you'll try it a handful of times, I hope anyway, that you would kind of sign on. It is, we can cut a couple of syllables out of our nickname and keep things flowing a bit more smoothly. But good catch, and thank you for that question.
I don't know if you'll actually answer this one because it's in your book. Did we learn why Connecticut is called the Nutmeg State?
Oh, I'm happy to answer it because I'll give you the shorthand version, but the story is far more interesting than I can say in a sentence or two. One of the most valuable spices of the late 18th and early 19th century, the years before refrigeration, was nutmeg. Not only because it was good in the things that we use it for today, but also because it was a very good flavor to mask meats that had, kind of been out too long, that were starting to turn, but that if you cooked them up, you still felt like you could eat them. So it in the days of not too great refrigeration practices, nutmeg was very popular. And nutmeg only grows in a couple of places in the world. One is an island, the Moluccas in the East Indies, and in the West Indies, an island in the Caribbean. Connecticut had a thriving West Indies trade. When coastal traders would go to the Caribbean, they would bring back nutmeg. And then in the early 19th century, we had all these young Connecticut men farm boys, who in the winters, they would load up a great big cart with things made by the tinsmiths over in Bristol and all of the new goods coming out of Connecticut's factories. They would head south and be Yankee peddlers. What they figured out, they'd take along little tins of nutmegs and sell them very, very profitably. They make a lot of money. And they realized, on these nights while they were sitting around the campfire, that if they whittled up a few wooden nutmegs and put them in the middle of the nutmeg can, a nutmeg doesn't look much different than a carved piece of wood, that no one would know till they were well away. And the story was that these Yankee peddlers were so charming that by the time you found out you'd been bamboozled, you just laughed it off and said, "Oh, that's just great. He got me." That's the story. Now, there have been people in the history of Connecticut who have been outraged at that nickname. And there was in the early move in the early 20th century to change the state's nickname to the Constitution State. Literally, there were even editorials in the not the Plain Dealer, in the Hartford Courant, saying, "Do not use Nutmeg State. It's a pejorative term and it makes the state look terrible," and blah, blah, blah. Well, we're still using it. And, I kind of like those clever Yankee guys sitting around the fire increasing their profits. So that's the short version of the story. If you want the longer one, it's in the book.
Where did the name Connecticut come from?
It is from the Connecticut River. The long tidal river was named by one of the tribes. It's ascribed at various times to the Pequots or the Mohegans. The fact of the matter is, we know it's from an Algonquian language root word. That's like saying it's from a Romance language root word. The Algonquian languages were the languages of all Native American people up and down the East Coast of the United States. So we know it's an Algonquian root word. It probably came from one of the Connecticut tribes. Indigenous people tended to name places after geographic features. So it was very common for, the land of the big mountain, or the Connecticut meant long tidal river, which describes the Connecticut River, which it's an estuary all the way up to Enfield, which is 60 miles into the interior. It has daily tides, and there's some degree of salt water as far up as 10 or 15 miles north of Hartford.
I have a question.
Sure.
Why doesn't the Samuel Clemens house smell like a cigar?
I thank you so much for that. And I can't figure it out. Every historic house museum I've been in, with maybe one or two exceptions, is always done up like the president is coming for dinner. You know, they always look just so perfect. And I always go into them and I think, no, people want to know what it was like to live here, not, you know, not to take photographs here, not to do the architectural digest feature here, but what was it like to live here? So I want to see socks on the floor and you know, spittoons in the corner and all those things. So it doesn't smell like cigar smoke because they, you know, they washed all of that away years and years ago. And in the reconstruction, Arthur, they've made it look exactly like the Twain House. It's quite beautiful. It's a wonderful place to visit, but they just left the cigars out. We don't smoke in public anymore.
Was he allowed to smoke in the house?
Oh, absolutely. Twain was the master of his domain. Nobody told him. If they'd have told him not to smoke in his house, you know, we'd still be hearing it reverberate. He is known for
Thank you.
having had, despite his, you know, his image as a humorist, the man had a temper. So
Thank you.
but thanks for the
Anyone else?
question.
I was gonna say, if anyone else doesn't want to use the chat and does want to ask a question out loud,
Oh, it's so nice to talk to people.
you have permission to unmute yourself.
Well, even if you don't want to unmute yourself, it's wonderful to see people. And, you know, one of the nicest things about doing Zoom talks is you do get these little, it's like, it's just a video frame image, but you get to see, you know, you just get this little window into other people's lives. It's like they open a little screen. It's like, and it's just, it's wonderful to see.
Tell Art to come over as we'll smoke our pipes.
Well, if no other questions, I certainly want to thank you on the behalf of the library. We can see lots of nice comments.
Oh, thank you so much. I should have actually clicked on the.
Oh, thank you. Very good presentation. Wonderful history. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you all and have a wonderful afternoon and, you know, stay safe. We're going through a bad patch, but it's all going to be better soon.
Thank you. I'm gonna go smoke my pipe.
Take a big puff for me. I used to smoke and loved every minute of it. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks again.
That's good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was
Bye-bye.
fun. Thanks, bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so very much.
Nice talk, great talk. Thank you.
Thanks. It was a great pleasure.
Take care.
Voice.
Bye-bye.
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 Pretty cool.
Hi, Lawrence.
Thanks, Laura.
Hello, how are you?
Good. It's a
Good.
good hour. That hour went fast.
Yeah, he's good. That's why he's the state historian.
Great.
And he's a teacher, you know, so, but you know, he's good.
Okay, leave here.
Oh, he was going to say something to me,
Do
but
we have a book to read for Neighbor Helping Neighbors? What is that you were talking about earlier?
that's a film that Ann Makepeace did. It's a very short film. It's 15 minutes, but on our local, literally our local first responders. And it's a wonderful film. And it gives you a lot of insight into what a lot of our local people or some of our local people do in their dedication that, you know, we're just not that aware of unless you've been a, you know, fireman or
Right.
rescue or something. So it's really, and the idea is to have a little discussion about it. And if there's things that some of us can do without becoming firemen at this point. So, but the film itself is really good. It's only, you know, it's like 13 minutes. So.
Oh, okay. but where do we see it?
Well, you sign on to just like this, and I mean, you sign into the Zoom program, and we'll show it to you, and then we'll break out into a little, discussion.
Are you going to show it on the 19th, right?
Yes, at the 19th? Yes, 19th, yes.
Okay. Okay, see you then. Bye.
All right, be well.